I that on my unfamiliar hill saw with uncomprehending eyes 100 of thy sunsets spill their fresh and sanguine sacrifice, ere the sun swings his noonday sword, must say goodbye to all of this, by all delights that I shall miss. Help me to die, O Lord. These words we have just heard sung were written by William Noel Hodgson, 23 years old, a young officer in the Devonshires. The poem was published at the end of June 1916. Noel was killed a few days later on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July the 1st. Must say goodbye to all of this, by all delights that I shall miss. Help me to die, O Lord. That same poem was read by Prince Harry on June 30th, 2016 at Thiepval, marking the centenary of the Battle of the Somme. Noel's father wrote to his sister 4 years later in 1920, I quote, "Our visit to the Devonshire cemetery was all we could wish. We had little difficulty finding it, and we spent 4 hours there. The grave plots are in 2 rows. About 8 or 9 lie in each plot, and a wooden cross in the centre has their names punched on tin tape. Our boy lies with 1 fellow officer and 8 private soldiers. He lies with his own comrades around him in this tiny close at the top of a hill, looking out over vast open land where the great winds blow, and in the very heart of the land for whose deliverance they all contended to the death." Noel's father, who wrote those words to his daughter, Noel's sister. Noel's father, Henry, was the first bishop of St. Edmundsbury and Ipswich, and he himself is buried looking out over very different terrain at the foot of the high altar. I'm grateful to my predecessor, Bishop Nigel, for pointing out this connection. So this place will forever be connected to Noel Hodgson, as to so many others who gave their lives in the horror of battle, or through sickness, or through succumbing to injury. We remember all the soldiers, the sailors, the airmen, the military corps, all those in support, and civilians. I spent a Saturday afternoon a couple of weeks ago quietly at the Cenotaph in Ipswich, reading the names of the citizens of the borough of Ipswich, row upon row upon row. And that just a small fraction of the 750,000 of the British military personnel who lost their lives in the Great War, itself a fraction of the 10 million military and 8 million civilian deaths. Here we are, a century on, a century that has passed of huge upheaval, of immense conflict, of appalling acts of inhumanity, aided by advances in technology that distance the perpetrators from the victims, where enemies are dots on screens, not screams from a few yards away. And at a time when the forces seem arrayed to continue on this treacherous path, we reach back over the decades to the years of the Great War, and the connections seem to remake themselves in an instant. The images of the trenches, the cries of the injured, the whistling of the bullets, films and plays and poems, the stories of our loved ones handed down generation to generation, our own visits to the battlefields, they all bring this back. And we see those connections being remade across our country and across our county. School projects, researching the stories of those who fought and died in the Great War. Churches and community centres across Suffolk commemorating their own fallen, not just as a name, but as a person who lived in this village or that town, whose descendants are known, just as we welcomed Daniel here this evening and Christopher Hodgson, Noel's great-nephew. These human connections, the stories, the reality of all that was borne by this nation and all the nations involved, this must never be forgotten, and nor will it be. Just in the past week, I've seen these connections made in a tiny 15th century chapel, Row Chapel in Hadley, where a poppy-covered chapel includes a commemoration of Private Ophir Jarvis, who died from wounds sustained at the Somme and whose grandson is a member of that chapel's congregation. Or at a confirmation last Sunday at a packed church, St Mary's at Coombs, where 2 of the seats were taken by perspex silhouettes of soldiers. And I will never forget the first time 3 years ago that I walked into Framlingham College Chapel to face there the testimonials to not 1, not 2, but 3 members of the college awarded the Victoria Cross from the Great War and its aftermath, including one to Captain Flowerdew, posthumously awarded for leading a cavalry charge at Bois de Moray in March 1918 that some regarded as a turning point in the war. That college, and it's typical of others in this county, lost 137 pupils and staff in that war, including 14 on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Villages and towns across Suffolk have devised their own memorials to make their own connections. And at the extraordinary Crimson Glory performance here in the cathedral this past Sunday night, someone reminded me that no one has told us to do this. No one has said, you must produce an act of remembrance. But each community has just got on with it. And so we have acres of rigging festooned with knitted, crocheted and fabric poppies from Walton to Walsham-le-Willows. And doubtless many of us have done our own research or reminded ourselves of our own family stories, connecting again and again. For my son's school project, we had to produce names of family members who died in the Great War. And in our case, that meant German relatives as well as English. Why have we all participated in this, in these acts of remembering, these acts of reconnecting with this time a century ago? Not for glory, though certainly for courage and sacrifice and endurance, beyond what most or many of us have experienced or probably will. Not for despair, though the war did not end all wars, and the despair of countless individuals traumatized by battle or the loss of loved ones is incalculable. There are too many examples of parents dying heartbroken within just a few years of their children. 1, 2, 3, 4 children killed in battle. Bishop Hodgson himself died within the year after visiting his son's grave. I believe it is the connections that we are making by these acts that has led us to do them, but not just the connections tracing back the stories of family or members of our village, but connections with something deep inside us about hope and the future. We live in an age where for many the future is fragile, uncertain, precarious. We don't look forwards with ease. Our children wonder what the world will be like. So we reach back to a time when the future was barely as far as the next day or the next hour. And not to reel in utter horror, though horror it is, but to uncover hope. Not optimism, which is wishful thinking, but hope, which is about our reality. And the ground for hope are those human qualities revealed in the Great War of sacrifice, of courage, of endurance, of comradeship, of cooperation in communities coming together. And even in that mythologized account of the 1914 Christmas Day truce, really a fragmentary, scattered observance, nevertheless, the instinct to connect as human beings across the divides that have been imposed was irresistible. There is something of human goodness in the midst of all this horror, and this is what we reconnect with. Goodness in the face of horror and evil, in the face of fear and death and incredible suffering. But goodness nevertheless, and human goodness that recognizes the goodness of another human being, friend and even foe. Acts of kindness, acts of heroism for the sake of a chum, acts of generosity for those fighting far away, even acts of reconciliation. Echoing those words in our second scripture reading, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. We see the horror, and we see human beings and communities rising up again from it. Not right away, we know. The distress and the anguish and the resentment immediately after the Great War was strong. But after a time, remembering what happened, with the resolve that it never happen again. And while it doesn't happen again, it nevertheless repeats itself, and it will happen again and again. And we reach back to make connections not just to people, not just to stories and memories, but to that somehow God-redeemed reality of what it is to be truly human, to that deep goodness that still rises up in the ghastly mud and the blood-sodden chaos of the Great War, goodness that tastes somehow of the eternal, that endures whatever the world holds, that bears hope that goodness and love ultimately prevail. It is the reality of a God who reveals that out of death, out of an appalling death, he suffered through his Son. Out of that comes resurrection. And despite that appalling death, It is a God who walks with us and bears us up through whatever we face, whether in the military or in civilian life, and a God who builds up in us those qualities of character, those gifts of sacrifice, courage, endurance, comradeship, cooperation, kindness, generosity, qualities that bear us through war and battle, bear us through the challenges of our daily life, but also the qualities we need to build peace. Amen.